Hello, it's me, Carly Will, and this is the online Lab Practical 3 Appendicular Muscles Part 1 presentation, because now I know it's going to take more than one part. So to start off, we're going to do muscles that act on the scapula. So first is the trapezius, and the trapezius originates at the occipital bone up here, and then it goes down the spines of C7 and all thoracic vertebrae. So it inserts at the acromion and the spine of scapula over here. And it stabilizes, elevates, rotates, and retracts scapula and extends the head. So right here, it's the shoulder shrugging motion going up. We talked about it with the neck because it forms the back part of the neck. And it kind of goes over to the front a little bit, like there's a little bit of overlap while it's trying to get to the lateral part of the clavicle. So it can be considered a neck muscle as well as a shoulder girdle muscle. On the skeletal model, you can see the origin and insertion pretty well. So it's going to take up this shape. It's going to kind of triangulate over here and fill up this whole space. Yeah. So the trapezius is kind of fun. It does a lot of stuff with moving, like shrugging your shoulders and kind of picking things up that way. Then there's the rhomboideus, major and minor. It originates at the spinous processes of C7 and T1 through T5. It inserts at the medial border of the scapula, so you can see that better on the skeletal model. Its action is to pull the scapula medially, stabilize the scapula, and rotate the glenoid cavity downward. And if you try to do this motion, if you try to bring your scapulas together towards one another, towards your spine, you can feel how your shoulder socket kind of goes down. Like it feels more like I can't move my shoulders when I pull my scapulas medially, because they're kind of locked in with the stabilization of the glenoid cavity when it rotates. So in the skeletal model, you can see how it would take up this spot. So there's a major and a minor. The major kind of takes up this space, and the minor is like that. But both are really important, and they're so well acquainted with each other. They're so similar in their origin, their insertion, and their action that you don't really need to cover them separately. You just cover them in one fell swoop. Then there's the levator scapulae. Oh, I need to say, on the rhomboideus, major and minor, if you look on this image and this image, let me get my pen. If you look at the shape of it, it's like a rhombus. So this is one of those muscles where the shape of the muscle is within the name, and then the relative shape and size of the major and the minor. But that's a pretty easy way to remember it. So the levator scapulae is, it originates at the transverse processes, which is the side parts of C1 through C4 of your cervical vertebrae. It inserts at the medial border of your scapula, superior to the spine. So you see if this is the spine of your scapula, it's going to do the medial border, which is the border that's closest to your midline, which is kind of where your spine is. So it's going to be right here. You can see how it kind of ends right there. And it originates in here under this because it's pretty deep, considering it's like under the trapezius and it's under some other stuff. Its action is to elevate and adduct the scapula. So an elevation of the scapula, I think of like kind of like shrugging your shoulders, which is the best way I could think of it. Goodness, try to like raise up your scapulae. They kind of adduct when you do it, anyways. It's just part of what they do. Can't really do one without the other. You see on the skeletal model how it just kind of follows like this line right here around the backside of what would be your neck to your shoulder. The pectoralis minor, it's under the pectoralis major, and it's a lot smaller. It originates at ribs 3 through 5, so 3, 4, 5. near the costal cartilage, so right where the bone meets the cartilage. And it kind of does two actions. So, with the ribs fixed, it'll draw your scapula forward and down. So whenever your ribs are like stationary, it's gonna do that, which is what we're, for this purpose, gonna kind of reference. But with your scapula fixed, like if you're setting your scapula where it needs to be, then it's gonna draw your ribs up. Okay, so there wasn't really a good picture for this, and I didn't know how to take pictures that would demonstrate this, so I just had to go online and find pictures and draw arrows, because if I were to take these pictures, I look terrible today. So it's going to draw your scapula forward and inferiorly, so that was like following this arrow was my train of thought. Yeah. So the pectoralis minor is going to run right here in kind of three strands, but they all converge to get to that process of the scapula. So the serratus anterior kind of makes it look it's a serration, like a serrated knife. See over here. It's going to originate on the lateral aspect, so the very side of your ribs 1 through 8, your true ribs. And it's going to insert on the vertebral border of the anterior scapula, which is a fancy way of saying the top part closest to your spine. Its action is to hold the scapula onto the chest wall, rotate the scapula, and adduct and raise the arm. So, about adduction, it adds into the body. That was probably the easiest one to demonstrate, because holding the scapula on the chest wall isn't a super great motion, but it is there to hold it all in. Rotating the scapula, kind of hard to demonstrate, but you get the point. And adduction and raising of the arm, so it can either pull the arm up like that, or it can add it towards your body. So you see right here, it's hard to demonstrate because I don't have a side view of the skeleton, but it's gonna kind of wrap around in that little serrated pattern to the front. It's right on the side, so you can see it if I had this arm up and I was looking at the side of the ribs, and it just goes like that. And you can see how it pulls the insertion towards the origin, how it pulls it forward and down a little. It's gonna pull that insertion like that for the motion. So moving on to muscles that act on the humerus. The pectoralis major is what Terry Crews does the pec pop in White Chicks and all that. So the origin is the sternum, clavicle, ribs 1 through 6, aponeurosis of the external oblique. So it's pretty big. It has a really big wide range. You'll see that on the skeletal model. It's going to insert on the intertubercular sulcus or groove, which is easier to say, but I typed sulcus everywhere before I realized you didn't teach it to us as sulcus, of the humerus, which is right between the tubercles of the humerus. It's easier to see on a picture. But its action is the prime mover of arm flexion, and it's going to adduct and medially rotate arm. There's a medial rotation diagram later, but for right here I was focusing on adduction of the arm. So you see how it's going to forces the insertion towards the origin. So it's going to pull the arm inward, downward, whatever it needs to do. If your arm's up, it's going to pull it down. If your arm is kind of up here, it's going to pull it back down. So yeah. The deltoid, that was probably a terrible noise, I apologize. The deltoid originates at the lateral aspect of the clavicle, acromion, and the spine of scapula. So it kind of wraps around. If this is like your AC joint, it's going to wrap around like that. It inserts on the deltoid tuberosity humerus, which is like a little hump on your humerus for it to grab onto. The action is arm abduction. So you can see how it's going to pull. If it originates here and it inserts here, when it contracts, it makes it just kind of whoop, and it pulls your arm up. But that's when it's acting as a whole. If it's working as individual fibers, which is kind of cool, it can be a synergist to other movements like adduction, abduction, flexion, and extension of the arm. So you'll see right here how it's definitely going to just pull it up. So that's going to make your arm shoot up when it contracts. It's going to grab it and it's going to want to decrease that angle, because right here this is longer than like it would be right there. The coracobrachialis originates on the coracoid process of the scapula and inserts on the humeral shaft. It's kind of a smaller one that you don't think about much. You can get the name from coracoid process, brachialis, meaning humerus. Its action is to adduct and flex the arm at the shoulder joint. So adduction of the arm at the shoulder joint and just bringing it down from here down to here. You add your arm back to your body. So you'll see how origin insertion, it's gonna, if your arm's out here, it's gonna tighten it up and shoot it back, which is gonna make it want to decrease the amount that it's contracting and pull your arm in. The supraspinatus originates at the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. So these ones are going to be the ones at the rotator cuff. These next few are going to be rotator cuff. I'm just going to write RC on them. But it's going to originate at the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, and it's going to insert at the greater tubercle of the humerus, which is like, I'll explain in a second. Its action is to stabilize adduction of humerus and stabilize the shoulder joint. So the rotator cuff just kind of makes it deeper for the humerus to hang on to. It makes the rotator cuff work so that your shoulder is stable and it can have controlled movements. So you'll see right here, it's gonna go, I don't have a humerus. Well, the humerus, the head of it kind of looks like this in the skull. So the greater tubercle where this one will grab onto is right here. So yeah, it's gonna go like that and help stabilize the rotator cuff and help you rotate. So the infraspinatus originates in the infraspinous fossa, which is below the spine of the scapula. It's going to insert on the greater tubercle of humerus, same place. Its action is lateral rotation of the humerus, and it holds the humeral head and glenoid fossa to stabilize shoulder, just like the rest of the rotator cuff. So you'll see right here the lateral rotation of the humerus is just kind of turning it outward. So turning it like turning your hand out. And then you see right here is the infraspinous fossa. It's going to start right there. Subscapularis is another part of the rotator cuff. It's just on the other side. It's in between your ribs and your scapula. So it's going to originate on your subscapular fossa, which under scapula. And it's going to insert on the lesser tubercle. So right here you see this would be the greater tubercle for those last few. This is the lesser tubercle. It's going to function in arm internal rotation, so it's going to contrast that. It's going to stabilize the humeral head and the glenoid fossa as well as part of the rotator cuff. So you see right here, it's going to pull if your arm's turned outward. When it contracts, it's going to pull back towards the origin. Teres minor originates at the lateral margin of the posterior scapula, which is easier to see on the skeletal model. It's going to insert on the greater tubercle of humerus, and its action is the lateral rotation of the humerus. So it's the same right here. It's also part of the rotator cuff, and it helps to make that glenoid fossa deeper and stabilize the shoulder for movement. So you'll see right here, origin insertion. Since it's on the back, when it pulls, it's going to make your arm turn outward. The teres major is not part of the rotator cuff. It's on the posterior surface is where it originates at the inferior angle of scapula. Its insertion is on the intertubercular sulcus of groove, intertubercular groove if you prefer. Its action is to extend, medially rotate, and adduct the humerus. It's also a synergist of the lats, the latissimus dorsi, but I didn't write that down. So it's going to add it back towards the body. It's also going to do the medial rotation that we just talked about, but it is not part of the rotator cuff. It's going to run right here. So you see how these are all like rotator cuff ones, but this one is not. Right here, it's going to pull that insertion towards the origin. The latissimus dorsi, I couldn't find a good image for what it does. I just know it gets sore when you do things. So I made one of my own with a little stick guy striking a blow, which I thought was cool. I didn't know it was part of striking a blow. But it originates it has an indirect attachment, to the spinous processes of the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae, which is like the vertebrae that run behind your ribs. And then we have lumbar vertebrae, last 3 or 4 ribs, and the iliac crest. So it's got a really wide range too. Its insertion is on the intertubercular sulcus of the humerus, which you wouldn't expect, but it's the same intertubercular groove. It medially rotates your arm and it brings your arm down to strike a blow. So you see right here, it's going to form, I can't see that color, story of my life. So it's going to go right here. It's going to fill up this whole space. It gets really sore when you do strenuous activity. I just know that your lats get a lot of work. Yeah. So picking up at muscles of the arm, forearm, and hand, we're going to go with the biceps brachii, which originates at the coracoid process. That's the short head, and then the supraglenoid, tubercle, and tip of the glenoid fossa is the long head. I just forgot to type that. It's been a long night. So it's going to insert at the radial tuberosity, and its action is powerful flexion and supination of forearm. So like when you think about biceps, you think about flexing your arms, flexing your muscles. You tell a little kid to flex and show me your muscles, they're going to end up flexing their biceps brachii subconsciously because that's what they think flexing is. So you see how he's pulling it up. Oh, you can't see. He's pulling up and, well, none of these colors make sense. Okay, pulling up and flexing right there. So it's going to bring that origin towards the insertion. It's going to bring the insertion towards the origin. It also functions in supination of the forearm, which is, I like to think of turning your hand so that you can hold a bowl of soup. So you see how the origin insertion, so it's going to go like that. This is how the fibers are going to run. So when it contracts, it's going to pull up. And that's why you get the bulging muscle that you do when it shortens, and that's why it's right there. So, you see how supination, you wouldn't think much about being part of the biceps job, but it has to do with the biceps tendon. So when the elbow is flexed, the biceps shortens, and it does what you usually think it's doing. The biceps tendon is doing its job. It's in its right place. It's where you would think that the biceps tendon would be, in that position, sitting on top. Well, when the forearm is supinated, the biceps moves proximally. So if you supinate your forearm, you supinate so your hand can hold a bowl of soup, you can feel how your biceps kind of picks up a little. And then if you do the opposite, you put your palm down, you can feel how your biceps kind of moves down. It's just a weird little thing, but it's so integral to the biceps tendon and the way that it works that these movements are used to diagnose a tear in your distal biceps tendon. If you don't experience this when performing these movements, you've got a problem with your tendon. You might have a complete tear. It's actually quite often ignored by medical professionals because they don't think much about supination and pronation, but it has a lot to do with diagnosing a complete tear. So moving on to the brachialis helps the biceps flex the forearm. So same illustration, picking up here. It's going to originate at the distal anterior humerus and insert at the coronoid process of the ulna. So you see right here, this is your ulna. So it's going to do right there. So it's going to run like that. You see how when it tightens, it's going to pull up. And here we go. So the brachioradialis originates at the lateral ridge of the distal humerus and inserts at the base of the radial styloid process, which is a pretty cool little part of the radius. The you'll see in the skeletal model. Its action is it's a synergist for forearm flexion, same movement here. So it actually takes a lot more muscles than you would think to flex. You think it's just about your bicep. Well, your bicep covers up all these other little ones, and you have some that connect more so to the forearm. It takes a lot of things, a lot of moving parts. But you see here how it's going to, since it's on the humerus, which makes it kind of cool because it runs like this whole thing. since it's on the humerus, it's gonna pull up. If it were just right here, if it were just on the radius and ulna, then you might just get a biceps-like bulge on your radius and ulna on your forearm. But since it's on the humerus, when it contracts, instead of creating a bulge, it pulls your hand up towards your shoulder, which is pretty cool. So then you have the superficial anterior forearm muscles. The anterior forearm muscles are superficial, intermediate, and deep. It's kind of hard to illustrate on this model, but you'll get the point. So there are a lot of them. We didn't have to be super specific, but just know that some of the origins are the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulna. Some insertions are the radius, the base of the metacarpals, the palmar aponeurosis, and the skin and fascia of palm. So it acts in flexing and adducting hand. So you can see how if you're holding your hand out in anatomical position, if you tighten those muscles on the anterior of your forearm, it's going to pull your hand up. Tendons run down to your fingers, it's pretty cool, or down to your palm, it's pretty cool. Also an adduction of the hand, pushing it out pinky ways. So you see right here, this is just the general family of them, and these are the most towards the surface forearm muscles. So the intermediate is the layer below the superficial. Some of the origins are medial epicondyle of humerus, coronoid process of ulna, the radius, and the posterior ulna. Insertions may be the metacarpal bases, the carpals, the middle phalanges, and they act to flex your hand in your middle phalange. So since they go all the way in the middle phalanges, they're going to pull the middle phalanges back. They have tendons that go all the way down there, which are really cool. And the same thing with the flexion. If you think about it, it's on the anterior arm. You're seeing an anatomical position. So yeah, same idea, but these are going to be under the superficial, but above the deep. So your deep, there's only a couple of them, and they're super deep. You can't see them on the model that we had, so I had to go find a picture. So they're going to originate at the anterior ulna and the radius, interosseous membrane, and the coronoid process. The interosseous membrane, I can't remember if I've talked about it before. It's the connective tissue membrane between two bones, so between the radius and ulna in this case. It's going to insert on the distal phalanx of the thumb, which is the furthest part of your thumb, the distal phalanges, furthest part of your fingers, and the distal radius. They act to flex the distal phalanges and thumb and pronate the forearm. So pronating the forearm is doing the opposite of supinating. It's just putting your hand down. You can't hold that sup anymore. And then we're gonna flex these distal phalanges. We're gonna bring them in. It's just like if you're ever do that thing where they tell you like you bend your finger and you can make your little thingy bounce. You can make your distal phalanx bounce. That's what I think of. And it's going to run in here, and it has so many insertions I didn't want to circle the whole hand, but these are going to run the deepest. So the flexor retinaculum, I think that's how you pronounce it, isn't a muscle, it's a connective tissue. So the origin and the insertion are kind of non-specific, but it goes over the carpals on the anterior side, forming the carpal tunnel. If you've ever heard of somebody having carpal tunnel syndrome, it's basically what forms like a roof over. It forms a roof over what's important passing through there, so that your nerve isn't exposed and your tendons aren't exposed. It's going to form the roof of this house to protect them. So sometimes your roof of your house gets inflamed and it starts compressing your median nerve, and that's when you get carpal tunnel syndrome, where you get tingling, numbness, pinching feeling. It's because your median nerve is being compressed by your flexor retinaculum, which is kind of cool. Next up is the triceps brachii. There are 3 heads to the triceps, hence the tri part of triceps, given off the number of origins. So the long head originates on the inferior margin of the glenoid cavity, which is your shoulder socket. It's going to be on the bottom of your shoulder socket. Posterior humerus on the lateral head. And the medial head's going to originate on the distal radial groove of the humerus. They're all going to insert on the olecranon of the ulna, which is like your elbow. So it basically does the opposite of the brachialis and the biceps brachii. It's going to pull your arm back, extend your elbow. So you can see right here, I just basically turn the graphic over, and it's going to go that way and pull your arm back and make that angle larger. So you see how it's going to antagonize because it's going to pull that insertion towards the origin. which is going to make your humerus and therefore your forearm, like your whole arm, it's going to move back. Then we have the superficial posterior forearm muscles. They're the ones that are on top, and we didn't have to be super specific, so I didn't. They're going to originate, some examples being the lateral supracondylar ridge, near your condyles of your humerus, and your epicondyle of your humerus, and the ulna. So they're going to insert onto the bases of the metacarpals 2, 3, and 5, or by tendon into the distal phalanges 2 through 5, which is everything but your thumb. So the action is going to be extending and abducting your hand and wrist and finger extension. So you can see right here we have extension, which is pulling it back, and then we're going to have abduction right here, putting your thumb towards you. And so you can see here how many different ways it's going to be able to pull that back and do all that. So on the deep posterior forearm muscles, the origin is on the ulna and the radius, or the interosseous membrane, or the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. There are a lot of different places it could be. It's going to insert on somewhere around the base of the thumb, metacarpal 1, proximal radius, or the trapezium, which is one of your carpal bones. And its action is to extend and adduct the thumb and supinate forearm. So it does a lot. We have the forearm supination, holding a bowl of soup. We have extension of the thumb, which in contrast with the flexion. So it's not flexion, it's moving it back outward, which is extension. And then thumb adduction is bringing your thumb in towards the rest of your fingers. If you're looking at it from the side, it's pulling it back up. So you see here, all this big area where it could be attached, because there's so many of them, there's so many little small ones, there's a lot of play in it. Then there's the extensor retinaculum, which is basically the counterpart of the flexor retinaculum. It's on the posterior side, and it serves to hold tendons for those extensor muscles that are headed to the phalanges and the metacarpals. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to breeze through these. Oh goodness, I didn't even circle it. So it's going to be right around here. It's going to be a band of connective tissue, just like the flexor retinaculum, but it's going to be on the other side. So now we're moving to the muscles of the hand, which we did in groups. So there's the thenar eminence, which is the ball of the thumb. It originates from different carpal bones. You see how it kind of takes up a little chunk of the wrist where the carpal bones would be, and it's going to insert on the distal thumb. And its action is thumb movement, including a thumbs up, which I forgot to put in here, but you know what a thumbs up is. Give yourself one right now. You just used your thenar eminence. So you see right here how it's got all these different phalanges to move, and how they're individual muscles, so it can isolate different movements, including the thumbs up. Then on the opposite side is the hypothenar eminence, which originates on the flexor retinaculum, the pisiform. It's going to insert on the fifth finger, your pinky, and the metatarsal 5, which is the metatarsal leading to your pinky. Its action is pinky movement. So you see it right here, and yeah, so it's going to originate down here at your pisiform and around the back at the, sorry, not around the back, and in the front at the flexor retinaculum, which is going to like run right here. So then it's going to go up, and it's going to insert on various parts of the pinky. And tune back in for part 2.